Ground has officially been broken on Volkswagen's PowerCo electric vehicle battery gigafactory in St. Thomas.
This is the world's largest automaker. They don't do a plan for just this year while Donald Trump's got tariffs. They're doing a plan looking forward.
Canada just scored a win that cuts through all the noise of the North American trade war. While Donald Trump doubles down on tariffs, emergency orders, and political theatrics, the world's largest automaker quietly made its choice, and it wasn't the United States. Volkswagen broke ground on its PowerCo EV battery gigafactory in St. Thomas, Ontario, the largest facility of its kind in Canadian history. And in a moment that should make Washington pause, a local official said the part no one in the U.S. wants to admit. This is the world's largest automaker. They don't make a plan for just this year while Donald Trump's got tariffs. They're making a plan looking forward. That single sentence captures the entire story tonight. Canada is the long-term bet. Trump's America is the short-term gamble.
The milestone kicks off development of 3 major buildings at the site, making it the largest facility of its kind in the country, with full production expected to begin in 2027. The facility is set to create up to 3,000 direct jobs, while protecting Ontario's auto manufacturing supply chain amidst the trade war.
Volkswagen's PowerCo has officially moved into full construction, marking the start of a multi-year industrial transformation for southwestern Ontario. The St. Thomas site is now home to 3 major buildings rising out of the ground, with full EV battery production set for 2027. The project promises around 3,000 direct jobs and thousands more across suppliers and the regional economy. For a community long tied to the ups and downs of the auto sector, this investment feels like a turning point, not just for employment, but for identity. Mayor Joe Preston described the factory as generational change that would allow families to stay, work, buy homes, and build a vibrant future without being forced to leave in search of opportunity. Yet the celebration comes with a message aimed well beyond Ontario. Volkswagen chose Canada at a moment when the United States is entering its most unpredictable trade cycle in years. Trump's new tariff regime has introduced a level of uncertainty that multinational companies simply cannot build billion-dollar strategies around. In contrast, Canada is executing a long-term industrial plan with clarity, consistency, and political alignment. And the timing is crucial. As global automakers race to secure stable access to batteries and minerals, any country offering predictability becomes a magnet for investment. Canada stepped into that role decisively. The groundwork now being poured in St. Thomas signals not only the rise of a factory, but the emergence of a national manufacturing strategy finally aligned with global demand. Companies do not fear high taxes or strict regulations as much as they fear unpredictability. And that unpredictability now defines U.S. trade policy under Donald Trump. His administration has imposed sweeping tariffs under IEEPA and Section 232, triggering retaliatory threats, court challenges, and mounting frustration from manufacturers. Reuters and Bloomberg both describe Trump's tariff landscape as one of the biggest business risks in North America today. Volkswagen saw all of this and walked the other way. It did not want a political gamble. It wanted a predictable, rules-based environment, and it found that in Canada. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada is presenting itself as a country that plans for decades, not for election cycles. Ottawa is building full EV supply chains from minerals to manufacturing, offering long-term investment credits, securing international partnerships, and pushing to double non-U.S. exports within 10 years. Volkswagen doesn't choose sites based on short-term headlines. It chooses based on energy stability, predictable climate policy, critical mineral access, and workforce reliability. Canada met every requirement. The United States, under Trump's tariff-driven strategy, did not. The calculation was simple. Canada is the safer investment, Canada is the smarter investment, and Canada is the forward-looking investment. Trump's goal was to force manufacturing back onto U.S. soil, but the outcome has been the opposite. By destabilizing cross-border supply chains and raising import costs unpredictably, Trump made the U.S. a riskier place to build long-term industrial projects. Volkswagen responded exactly how a global automaker would. It chose the country with stability, critical minerals, clean electricity, and a government capable of delivering consistent industrial policy. Even the messaging from Ontario officials reinforced this reality. Volkswagen is planning beyond Trump, meaning the company sees the U.S. as too erratic to anchor a generational project. Canada, meanwhile, offers continuity regardless of political turbulence. This is why analysts describe Canada's EV build-out as one of the most strategically coherent industrial pivots in the Western Hemisphere. While the United States spends political energy on tariff battles, Canada is quietly constructing a continent-wide supply chain, stretching from mining towns to battery campuses to export-ready auto plants. The Volkswagen deal is not an outlier. It is a preview of where the industry is moving next. This decision also fits into a broader shift across the world. The U.S. is facing a surge of corporate lawsuits over Trump's emergency tariffs. Mexico has warned of reassessing its own manufacturing strategy. Europe is preparing retaliatory measures if U.S. tariff escalations continue. China's rare earth leverage remains a looming pressure point despite the temporary truce negotiated at APEC 2025. Canada, however, is moving in the opposite direction, building stability, broadening trade ties in Asia, and offering companies like Volkswagen a future insulated from Washington's political storms. The St. Thomas Gigafactory is not an isolated win. It is the industrial expression of a country repositioning itself for a more multipolar economic world. For Canada, this project is a declaration of industrial confidence. It signals that the country can win global-scale factories, build complete EV ecosystems, and compete directly with the United States. It strengthens local economies, secures high-quality employment, and anchors Canada firmly in the clean technology manufacturing race. More importantly, it proves something Canadians often forget. When the world looks for reliability, it looks north. For the U.S., the implications are significant. Tariff chaos does not attract investment. Consistency does. Volkswagen's choice demonstrates that Trump's protectionist strategy is not reshoring industry, it is pushing it away. The U.S. had every structural advantage: larger markets, larger workforces, aggressive incentive programs, and political pressure on automakers to stay domestic. Yet when Volkswagen had to place a once-in-a-generation investment, it chose Canada. It should not be a mystery why. Companies can manage competition, they cannot manage chaos. The groundbreaking in St. Thomas is more than a milestone for Canada's EV future. It is a moment of clarity for North America. Volkswagen made its choice, and in doing so, revealed the deeper truth shaping global industry. The future belongs to the country that can think beyond the next press conference. Canada is offering stability, clean energy, long-term planning, and a government aligned behind a coherent industrial strategy. Trump's America is offering unpredictability, tariff shockwaves, and policies that shift faster than companies can build factories. Volkswagen saw the difference. The world sees it too. And if more companies follow the same logic, Canada will not just keep pace, it will lead. Canada just pulled off one of its most confident power moves of the decade. Standing in northern British Columbia, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled 6 nation-shaping megaprojects that, together, mark the biggest shift in Canadian economic strategy since the early days of Confederation. And while the announcement was aimed squarely at Canadians, the political aftershocks traveled instantly across the border. Donald Trump, who has spent his second term escalating tariffs and lecturing Ottawa on dependence, suddenly faced a Canada that wasn't retreating or reacting. It was building, boldly, loudly, and on its own terms.
Strategy is to develop new trade and economic corridors that help us diversify our markets and build our independence. The Northwest Corridor has extraordinary potential to unlock critical minerals development, clean power transmission, all under Indigenous leadership. The corridor involves building new transmission lines, upgrading highways, installing fiber and cell towers, and investing in communities, ports, and railways. By doing so, we'll strengthen our position as a global leader in clean energy and a leader in critical minerals.
Carney's announcement, delivered at a BC hydro facility, was nothing short of a national blueprint. He introduced a clean energy strategy built on rapid tax incentives, a new productivity superdeduction, and the Canada Infrastructure Bank's $10 billion commitment to push clean power projects forward. He made clear that nuclear energy, long stuck in political limbo, would now play a central role, with small modular reactors and utility-scale nuclear entering the mainstream of Canada's future grid. The Prime Minister then shifted northward, revealing that the Iqaluit Hydro Project is being formally referred to the Major Projects Office. This isn't just a power project, it's the first fully Inuit-owned hydro development in Canadian history. It's expected to eliminate nearly $2 billion in diesel use over the next half-century and establish a new foundation for Arctic sovereignty at a time when international interest in the North is rising sharply. Coming just months after Trump's renewed fascination with Arctic real estate and U.S. military expansion in Alaska, the symbolism was unmistakable. Carney moved west again, this time toward the Northwest Critical Conservation Corridor, a sweeping vision that blends Indigenous-led economic development with one of the largest conservation undertakings on the planet. The corridor will open long-blocked access to the Golden Triangle's mineral deposits, reinforce transmission networks, modernize remote highways, expand fiber and cellular access, and create new rail and port capacity. The conservation area tied to the plan would be as large as Greece, a direct statement that Canada is capable of balancing growth with stewardship. To make that possible, the Canada Infrastructure Bank announced a $140 million loan for the North Coast Transmission Line, a crucial piece of infrastructure that will unlock LNG production, support multiple mining projects, and anchor a clean energy industrial corridor stretching across northern British Columbia. Carney highlighted that this line alone could create $10 billion in economic activity and reduce emissions by up to 3 million tons annually. The Prime Minister then turned to the global competition for critical minerals. Demand for these resources, nickel, graphite, tungsten, copper, and dozens more, is expected to rise 5-fold by 2050. At the moment, production and processing are dangerously concentrated in one country, China. Carney made clear that Canada's geological wealth and political stability position it to become the world's most trusted supplier, especially as the United States struggles to stabilize its EV and industrial policies under Trump's unpredictable tariff regime. To accelerate this shift, Carney presented a new sovereign fund dedicated to critical minerals projects, a first and last mile infrastructure program, and expanded tax credits to help fast-track development. He highlighted 3 projects being sent to the Major Projects Office: Canada Nickel's Crawford Project in Ontario, Nouveau's Matawini Graphite Mine in Quebec, and Northcliffe's Sisson Tungsten Mine in New Brunswick. Each represents a pillar of a supply chain the world urgently needs. Crawford in particular, one of the largest nickel reserves globally, could set the benchmark for low-carbon, even carbon-negative mining. Carney concluded the event by connecting every project back to a larger narrative. Canada is entering a new era of nation-building, one defined by clean energy, northern sovereignty, Indigenous partnership, and economic independence rather than vulnerability to U.S. pressure. Carney's strategy lands at a moment when Donald Trump is relying on tariffs as the central tool of U.S. economic power. Washington has imposed sweeping duties across Canada's auto sector, steel, agriculture, lumber, and clean tech industries. But instead of playing defense, Carney is building the foundation of an industrial future that doesn't require America's permission. This is a structural counterpunch, one Trump did not expect. On Arctic sovereignty, the contrast is even sharper. The United States has increased northern deployments, revived long-dismissed discussions about controlling Greenland, and framed the Arctic as a strategic frontier. Carney's emphasis on an Inuit-owned hydro system wasn't accidental. It was a declaration that Canada intends to lead in its own north, not follow American priorities. Clean, local, and permanent energy infrastructure is far more powerful than any symbolic speech or diplomatic statement. It's sovereignty in physical form. On critical minerals, Canada is outpacing the United States in a race Washington claims to lead. Trump's tariffs on EV components were meant to drag investment back to American soil, but instead they've destabilized supply chains and discouraged automakers from committing to new facilities. Canada's approach, sovereign funds, long-term infrastructure, indigenous equity, expedited permitting, and enormous grid expansions, looks like a country preparing for the next century, not the next election cycle. The U.S. remains dependent on global imports. Canada is positioning itself to become the supplier everyone else depends on. The Northwest Corridor adds another strategic layer. If completed, it allows Canada to ship minerals, energy, and manufactured goods directly to global markets through Pacific ports, without relying on American transit routes. This is the part that truly rattles Trump's worldview. His tariff strategy is built on one assumption, that Canada needs America more than America needs Canada. A fully developed northern corridor undermines that assumption entirely. The indigenous ownership framework is an often overlooked but deeply consequential shift. By turning communities into shareholders rather than stakeholders, Carney is rewriting how Canada builds major projects. This stands in stark contrast to the U.S., where conflict between federal agencies and tribal nations often stalls development. Canada, under Carney's model, turns partnership into a competitive advantage. Finally, there's the national pride dimension. After years of reacting to tariffs, plant closures, and supply chain threats from Washington, Canada has been hungry for a moment that feels like forward motion. Carney's sixth project announcement captures that. It reframes the national conversation. Instead of worrying about Trump's next move, Canada is making its own.
Carney's 6 mega projects are more than infrastructure announcements. They're a statement of identity. They mark a Canada that is ready to build, ready to lead, and ready to assert its place in North America without asking for permission. Trump may escalate, Washington may push back, but something has shifted. For the first time in a long time, Canada isn't just responding to the world, it's shaping it. So, here's the question for viewers. Will these projects roll out fast enough to secure Canada's new position, or will Trump double down and try to pull the continent back into his orbit?
We begin on that profanity-filled rant by U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra. Hoekstra was at a high-profile event in Ottawa Monday meant to celebrate the Canada-U.S. relationship.
A witness says that he could be heard swearing, using the F word, and mentioning Doug Ford, his name, and that it appears that Pete Hoekstra was upset about this Ontario ad.
It began with a shocking outburst in the middle of Ottawa's most formal diplomatic evening. At a high-profile Canada-U.S. gala, U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra turned the room silent when he began swearing at Ontario's trade representative, David Patterson. Witnesses said the ambassador used profanity, even mentioning Doug Ford by name in front of diplomats and business leaders. The event was supposed to be a symbol of friendship. Every year, both countries raise their glasses for a joint friendship toast. But this time, only the Canadian side spoke. The American ambassador stayed seated. What should have been a quiet moment of goodwill turned into a public embarrassment and a sign of just how deep the rift between Washington and Ottawa has grown. The question now isn't just about one man losing his temper. It's about what that anger reveals, a frustration that runs straight from the Trump White House to America's closest ally.
Ambassador Hoekstra's anger didn't come out of nowhere. He was triggered by an Ontario government ad that aired across U.S. television screens. The ad used the voice of former Republican President Ronald Reagan,
warning about the dangers of high tariffs, the same ad that infuriated Donald Trump days earlier. Trump declared that all trade talks with Canada were terminated and threatened a new 10% tariff on Canadian goods. Within hours, the mood in Washington turned from tense to explosive. Hoekstra, a Trump loyalist, seemed to take that anger personally. But underneath the surface, the outrage had little to do with advertising. It was about control. For months, Washington has tried to pressure Canada to yield in ongoing trade discussions. Instead, Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford, stood firm. They used calm diplomacy and sharp strategy rather than panic. The Ontario ad became more than just a TV spot. It became a quiet statement that Canada would no longer play by Washington's intimidation rules. And that, perhaps, is what truly set the ambassador off. When diplomats start shouting, it's usually because their arguments are failing. Doug Ford's response was measured, confident, and unmistakably Canadian. Pacing reporters, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult back. He simply called on the ambassador to apologize and move forward. He reminded everyone that Ontario's trade representative had done nothing wrong. He was defending his province in the face of constant attacks. Ford even used humor to lower the temperature, saying the cheese slipped off the cracker. But behind the humor was a powerful message. Ontario would not be bullied, not by tariffs and not by temper. Ford framed the moment as a defense of both his province and his country. He reminded Americans that Canada was being targeted, its auto industry, its steel sector, its manufacturing base. And he made clear that rolling over was not an option. When you attack our province, you attack our country, he said earlier this week. For ordinary Canadians, the scene felt familiar, frustration mixed with resilience. In Ford's tone, there was no hostility toward Americans themselves. He said, "We love Americans," separating people from politics. But he made no secret of how he viewed Trump's behavior. It was blunt, emotional, and deeply human, a reflection of how many Canadians now feel about their once trusted ally. While Ford was speaking publicly, Prime Minister Mark Carney remained silent, strategically silent. He was in South Korea at the time, attending the same summit as President Trump. The two leaders sat at the same dinner table, but didn't speak. Trump later posted online, "We didn't come to South Korea to see Canada." That silence, though, spoke volumes. Carney didn't need to trade insults. His policies have already begun reshaping Canada's trade position. Over the past months, Ottawa has finalized or expanded major economic agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Canada is also deepening its investment links with ASEAN nations, a diversification strategy designed to reduce reliance on the U.S. market. In other words, while Washington has chosen confrontation, Ottawa is quietly building alternatives. Canadian exports to Asia and Europe are rising. New investments are flowing into critical minerals, nuclear technology, and advanced manufacturing. Former officials from both sides of the border have described the current climate as the lowest point in decades. John Manley, Canada's former deputy prime minister, said the relationship has shifted from partnership to performance, more theater than diplomacy. Gordon Giffen, a former U.S. ambassador under Bill Clinton, said ambassadors are supposed to deliver difficult messages, not profanity. He admitted that the outburst showed poor judgment and warned that the U.S. approach was undermining progress. Both men agreed that trust, once the backbone of the Canada-U.S. relationship, has been eroding fast. Canada's confidence in American reliability has been shaken. The United States, once seen as a predictable ally, now acts like a volatile negotiator. This breakdown is more than symbolic. Trade between the two countries accounts for nearly $800 billion a year, according to 2024 data from Statistics Canada and the U.S. Department of Commerce. But the tone from Washington is making long-term cooperation harder to sustain. What used to be a partnership of equals now feels like a power struggle. The results of Trump's trade offensive are now clear. Automakers like Stellantis and GM have pulled investment from Ontario, yet rising costs and inflation inside the U.S. are straining supply chains and angering American workers.
Rather than isolating Canada, Washington has isolated itself. European and Asian partners are strengthening ties with Ottawa while the U.S. loses diplomatic goodwill even among its closest allies. Canada's leadership, meanwhile, has found a confident, steady voice. The Reagan ad, once a simple reminder of economic common sense, has turned into a symbol of how far U.S. trade policy has drifted from its own principles. Every insult from Washington only reinforces Canada's resolve to move independently. What Trump hoped would divide Canada has instead united it, around leaders determined to defend their economy and their dignity.
Back in Ottawa, the empty chair at the gala's toast said more than any speech could. The United States, once Canada's closest friend, couldn't even share a glass of champagne. Carney's government continues its quiet path, expanding global partnerships, supporting industry, and rebuilding confidence. Ford stands publicly defending his province, demanding dignity and respect. Together, they reflect a new phase of Canadian identity. Steady under pressure, firm in principle. Meanwhile, Washington's outbursts keep making headlines. When ambassadors swear and presidents post insults, it doesn't show power, it shows frustration. In the end, Trump's tariffs didn't break Canada. They revealed its resilience. The louder Washington shouts, the calmer Ottawa seems. And in that silence, in the moment when only one side raised a glass, the world saw what real strength looks like.
If you don't change, this is done. Something is going to break. We are at the edge of a cliff.
Mr. Speaker, there's a little thing called cause and effect. And the cause that the Leader of the Opposition is missing is the U.S. tariffs. The U.S. tariffs that are hitting steel, the U.S. tariffs that are hitting lumber, the U.S. tariffs that are hitting our auto sector. That's why we need to build this country strong. That's why we're getting spending under control. That's why we're going to spend less to invest more. I believe in this country.
In Ottawa, the Parliament chamber was alive with tension. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre rose to his feet and accused Prime Minister Mark Carney of driving the country into economic ruin. He painted a picture of lost jobs, spiraling debt, and wasted taxpayer money. To many Canadians watching, it may have looked like a domestic fight over budgets. But behind the shouting hung a larger force that had already shaped the economy. That force was not Carney's spending plan. It was the heavy tariffs imposed by Donald Trump's administration. What unfolded in Parliament was more than partisan theater. It was a mirror of the confrontation between Canada and the United States. Poilievre tried to make Carney the villain. Carney turned the stage around, pointing at Trump's trade policies as the true source of Canada's challenges. The debate was about more than fiscal policy. It was about whether Trump's economic aggression was backfiring on both countries. Trump's tariff strategy did not only hit factories, farms, and border towns. In Canada, it created a second battlefield, Parliament itself. What began as an economic squeeze quickly turned into political ammunition. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre seized on every new tariff to attack Prime Minister Mark Carney. Each duty imposed by Washington, whether on lumber, autos, or furniture, became a talking point in Ottawa. Poilievre framed the tariffs as proof of Carney's weakness abroad. When the United States doubled duties, he claimed it showed Carney could not protect Canadian jobs. When China raised its barriers, he argued Carney's diplomacy had failed again. Even trade blockades in Europe were tied back to his trips overseas. The message was simple but powerful. Everywhere Carney went, Canadians ended up paying more. This was the double blow effect of Trump's policies. First came the economic pain, job losses, shrinking exports, and billions in lost investment. Then came the political fallout. Opposition attacks amplified that pain, turning external tariffs into domestic criticism. The more tariffs Washington unleashed, the more Poilievre could portray Carney as ineffective. In this way, Trump's policies destabilized more than markets. They shook Canadian politics itself. Ottawa was forced into a constant defensive posture, with Carney explaining not only to workers and businesses why tariffs were rising, but also to Parliament why his leadership still mattered. The tariff war was not just cross-border economics. It was a political earthquake echoing through Canada's capital. Inside Parliament, Poilievre accused Carney of failing Canadians. He cited the loss of 86,000 jobs since Carney took office and claimed that 50 billion Canadian dollars in investment had left. He warned of 600 billion in new public debt. For him, Canada was at the edge of a cliff. Carney responded by shifting the focus south. The real shock, he argued, came from U.S. tariffs on steel, lumber, and autos. These were industries central to Canada's economy. He pointed out that no government program could fully shield the country from that impact. To defend Canada's position, Carney cited fundamentals: a AAA credit rating from both S&P and Moody's, the lowest deficit and debt to GDP in the G7, and long-term interest rates even lower than in the US. By presenting facts, he reframed the debate. Canada was not collapsing under mismanagement. It was weathering an external storm unleashed by Washington. For every dollar Canada lost, American industries paid their own price. By September 2025, construction firms reported rising costs for lumber. Furniture retailers faced higher import bills. Automakers in Michigan and Ohio, supposedly the winners of Trump's tariffs, found that cross-border parts had become so expensive that production slowed. Farmers were also hit. When Canada diversified away from U.S. suppliers, American exporters lost contracts. China's retaliation on Canadian canola and seafood further disrupted global supply chains, compounding uncertainty for U.S. agriculture. Instead of pulling jobs back, tariffs created losses on both sides. The World Trade Organization received complaints, and allies questioned whether the U.S. was undermining the very system it had built. At home, inflation crept up. By the fall of 2025, consumer groups warned tariffs acted like hidden taxes on households. What was meant to show strength looked more like a self-inflicted wound. Poilievre said Canada lost $50 billion of investment. Yet the U.S. was losing tens of billions in trade and credibility while forcing its own people to pay higher prices. Trump's economic nationalism was backfiring. Amid turbulence, Carney emphasized resilience. Canada had to build new markets and reduce dependence on the U.S. Critical minerals were one way forward. With large reserves of nickel, cobalt, and lithium, Canada aimed to supply the EV sector. The cobalt sulfate refinery underway in Ontario, expected to produce enough for 1 million EVs annually, was a symbol of that shift. Carney argued that Canada needed to invest in projects of national importance, from housing to clean energy to minerals. These would reduce vulnerability to tariff shocks. Critics said his diplomacy was weak, that every foreign trip brought new tariffs. But Carney framed those efforts as the necessary groundwork of repositioning Canada in a fractured global economy. Poilievre pushed a simpler message: Carney was costing Canadians their jobs. Carney countered with data and long-term vision, insisting that resilience and diversification were the only real answers to Trump's disruption. The fiery exchange in Parliament was more than a domestic quarrel. It was a snapshot of the ripple effects of Trump's trade war. Poilievre tried to brand Carney as the source of hardship. Carney pointed to Washington, insisting U.S. tariffs were the real disruptor. Trump promised prosperity for American workers. Instead, tariffs fueled inflation, fractured alliances, and provoked retaliation. For Canada, the pain was real, but also a push toward diversification. The clash in Ottawa showed that Canada would not accept a subordinate role. The real question remains. Trump's tariffs were designed to strengthen America's hand. But with costs mounting on both sides, it is clear the backfire is real. The test is not whether Canada can endure. It is whether the United States can afford the price of Trump's gamble.